This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Drew Ricketts and Joe Gerken with K-State begin today's show with part of their Fins, Fur, and Feathers podcast as they chat about raccoons and what control options are available. K-State Extension cow-calf specialist Jason Warner keeps the show rolling as he explains research that looks into the salt and mineral consumption variability of cattle. Ending the show is K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk as he recommends putting more effort into trying to eliminate spots where fly larvae commonly concentrate, such as behind feed bunks, around calf hutches, and beneath water troughs. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Tuesday show with part of the Fins, Fur, and Feathers podcast episode from K-State's Drew Ricketts and Joe Gerken.
Well, let's start out. What is a raccoon? I think we know they're the masked bandit, but tell us a little bit about them.
Well, they're throughout North America. There's actually a northern raccoon that's in North America and a southern raccoon that's in South America, and they do look a little bit different.
They're different species?
Yep, they're different species. Those southern raccoons, what I remember from seeing them dead on the road in Paraguay was they didn't have rings on their tails, but otherwise they look fairly similar. They're in the carnivore family. An interesting thing about their genus, their genus is Procyon, which means before dog. Just a really adaptable mammal that lives pretty well anywhere where there might be trees to provide cover, old buildings to provide cover, places where holes can be dug in the ground to provide cover. They do like to be around some sources of water. But they're not as tied to water as it might seem like they are if you're in an eastern part of Kansas or the Great Plains. We do find them quite a ways from water out west.
You know, I know that raccoons can cause problems,
sure,
right? And so what are some of the ways, maybe not the nesting birds per se, but what are some of the ways that we can manage some of those conflicts? Or what are some conflicts you're familiar with?
Sure.
Start there.
Sure. The kinds of conflicts that occur can vary depending on where we're at, the context of the situation. So in urban environments, the main sources of conflict are raccoons getting into the trash as a food source and stringing the trash around. Another source of conflict is raccoons fooling with bird feeders and, either eating food out of it or spilling food all over the place. Conflicts associated with raccoons digging in yards can be common in urban areas or around a farmstead and that sort of thing too. And then conflicts between raccoons and pets are fairly common, where we have homes and pets around and that sort of thing. And then the final one would be sort of that disease transmission risk. And I left out also raccoons getting into houses, right? Getting into structures that we may not want them to be in and using those as den sites, basically.
So what do you do if that happens? If you have raccoons getting in causing problems,
sure, what
can we do about it?
Sure. So, if we've got raccoons that are coming into a yard and causing problems in a yard, then there's a few different things that we can do. And really, regardless of what the problem is, we oftentimes try to do the non-lethal approaches first, because if we don't, even if we do remove a few problem animals first, if we don't implement those non-lethal strategies, then we're going to have a recurring problem. It may not recur next week after we remove a coon. It may not recur next month, but it's going to recur next year or the following year or something like that if we don't get rid of that root cause. If we've got raccoons getting into a corn patch, a sweet corn patch, or a garden somehow, then if we can exclude those raccoons, that's really the answer. When we're thinking about good exclusionary primary methods for keeping raccoons out of a garden or something like that. Fencing, and especially electrified fencing, is going to be important. It needs to be electrified fairly low to the ground, because if they can crawl under it without getting shocked, then they're going to figure out a way to do that. Also, if they can climb or jump over a fence and it's not electrified, then they're really good climbers, and so that's not a good way to keep them out. A lot of times what I recommend to folks, if it's a smaller garden sort of situation, is electrified poly mesh. If you look at poultry netting, electrified poultry netting, you can find these. It's basically a self-contained fence. It's got the posts in it. It's got like a web of fence, and that's electrified. And you can put that around a garden and really keep the raccoons out. A raised bed sort of system that is tall enough so that the raccoons can't jump up into the raised bed, and the sides are made out of a material that they can't climb. And, we're talking about waist high or higher as far as the height of those raised beds. One of the ways that we contribute to a lot of problems by critters like raccoons and other ones that we've talked about before is by having food resources available. So removing those food resources would be a habitat modification technique. So we come back to that acronym HER. I went backwards, but habitat modification. If we get rid of bird feeders, that solves a lot of problems in yards. We might have other kinds of wildlife feeders, like a deer feeder or something like that. If you've got that out there and raccoons can get to it, they're going to eat the feed. And that's really a way that a lot of hunting properties concentrate raccoons on their property, because, we've got these protein or corn or whatever kind of feeder out there for the deer, but the raccoons have easy access to that, and they're going to eat that if it's out there. Sure. And they're going to cause damage around those sorts of things. And so removing those food sources can be important. Other things, keeping them out of your trash, making sure they can't tip your trash containers over, making sure we've got good lids on our trash containers so that they can't get in, and that includes dumpster lids. I've seen a number of times where raccoons could get on top of a dumpster and lift that lid up and get in, but then they couldn't get back out. Weighting those lids so that they can't get underneath of them is important. If we've got pet food out all the time, then we're going to eventually have raccoons and skunks and opossums and these sorts of critters, sometimes coyotes, depending on where you are, on the porch, eating that pet food or wherever it is in the yard. They're going to come take advantage of that resource. And, a really easy fix is just feeding your pet once a day, putting the food out, they get their fill, and then you take any remaining food back away. That's really, the veterinarians that I've had, I'm not a veterinarian, but the veterinarians that I've had have always told me that that's really the best feeding strategy for most dogs and cats anyway, is to feed them once a day, let them get their fill, and then that's what they get.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, if we've tried all those things, so we've put out exclusions or we've gotten rid of feed and we're still having problems, I assume we should trap these animals and maybe release them somewhere else. Is that what you would recommend?
That's what a lot of people want to do.
Yeah.
And that, from the mindset of trying to get the best outcome for these critters and those sorts of things, that's where a lot of people's heads go. But the reality is that most critters don't live when we move them around. Raccoons are one of the species that we can see kind of the higher end of survival when we do trap them and move them long and far enough that they can't come back. So we're talking more than 10 miles. There was a study in Canada that found about 50% survival for raccoons that were translocated over the long term. Wow. And that's about as good as you're going to see when we're talking about trapping and moving critters.
So what are the downsides if I want to take that chance?
Sure.
Why not? What else is going wrong with that situation?
Well, anytime we move a critter, we're not just moving the critter. We're also moving anything that's on the outside or the inside of that animal. So we've been talking about disease every once in a while. The diseases that those raccoons raccoons might have. That could be distemper. It could be rabies. We don't have a lot of rabies in raccoons in the Central Great Plains, but if you're in the eastern United States, then they would be the main reservoir for rabies out there. So diseases, moving parasites around on the landscape, that's another reason that we don't want to do this. One of the big concerns that folks have that's kind of a motivation for moving critters around is that we're worried that we're going to somehow damage ecological integrity or hinder the populations of raccoons, right? And there's 4 to 6 times, if you look at that full graph, there's 4 to 6 times more raccoons now, or at least that's what that index says, than there was in the 80s. Yeah. So we're really not running a risk of being shy on raccoons. And so with a species that is not a threatened or endangered species or somehow in some other way in need of conservation, then, that euthanasia is appropriate. Another concern about moving critters around is that once a critter has learned to take advantage of the resources that you have, then they're going to find and take advantage of those resources somewhere else. I think a lot of folks have the misunderstanding that an agency like Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks or Missouri Department of Conservation wants you to bring your raccoons from your property that are causing problems out to their wildlife area because it's a public wildlife area, right? Well, I haven't looked at the regulations in Missouri or Oklahoma or Nebraska, but I would guess that they're fairly similar to Kansas's on these. And Kansas's regulation is that to release wildlife that you've caught somewhere else, you have to have landowner permission. And that includes on public land.
It sounds like the best outcome here is to euthanize that animal,
sure,
right? And if it's causing damage, my understanding is that that's legal to do. Is that correct, at least in Kansas?
So in Kansas, broadly, landowners and legal occupants is how the definition would read, or nuisance wildlife control operators can control using lethal means wildlife that are causing property damage. They do have to try first to solve the problem with non-lethal means.
Once again, that was K-State's Drew Ricketts and Joe Gerken with part of their Fins, Fur, and Feathers podcast episode. You can hear the whole episode by following the links in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now, but stick around because we have more for you up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show discussing work that's been done when it comes to mineral and salt consumption, what that means for producers and the industry. And then to talk about it, we're joined by K-State Extension cow-calf specialist Jason Warner. Jason, thanks for joining us today.
You're welcome, Shelby. Appreciate the opportunity to be on, as always.
Jason, why have you taken the time to look into salt and mineral consumption for cattle?
Yeah, so really when you take a step back and you look at it, we think about putting together good, practical, well-balanced nutrition programs for our cow-calf herds. We know that mineral and vitamin nutrition is a really important component of the overall nutrition plan that we think about, and we think about meeting animal requirements, and certainly supplementing salt and mineral premixes or formulated supplements is a very common practice that's done across the industry with our cow-calf herds and with our stocker and grazing herds that we have, not only here, of course, within the state of Kansas and the Great Plains, but all around the country and globally as well, too. And it's a very common practice to provide those micronutrients into those animals, and doing that on a free choice basis is a very common practice with the way our herds and our management is structured in most of our operations around the country. And so, really when you take a look at it, as I think about it for our cow-calf producers, when we think about the value of mineral supplementation and why it's important, we know that it's really important for a variety of different biological processes and key things that go on from a physiology standpoint. We know that it's really important from that aspect. But I think practically, really being able to look at some of the factors that influence consumption in these free choice settings is really critical, because that really influences how well we do, or maybe how poorly we do at meeting the requirements of that cow herd. And then also too, when we think about making sure that we do a good job of providing that supplement, providing that mineral or that vitamin premix, and getting that at the proper amount is really important from a cost standpoint as we think about it. And so I think as you look at it from those aspects, making sure that we're doing a good job of understanding the variation and understanding that better is a really key component of this research. And certainly as I look at it, as I work with producers around the state, questions that I commonly get are related to what is influencing our consumption. We see big variations in consumption from one cow herd to the next, or from one pasture to the next. If we've taken the time and we've spent the money on a certain product, and then cattle don't eat it, or cattle eat it well above the recommended level, that's not good from an economic standpoint, right? But also at the same time too, when we think about it from the nutritionist standpoint or from the feed manufacturer standpoint, understanding some of these variables that can influence consumption certainly has value for those allied industry partners as well too.
And what do you see as being some of those major variables that can influence consumption?
So some of the things that we look at that at least the data to date would suggest that have a pretty substantial impacts on consumption of a free choice product would be things like salt, phosphorus, and then also the carrier, or the main component of ingredient, the main ingredient component that a free choice product is manufactured with. And certainly we can see that when we maybe look at certain premixes or sources of micro minerals and vitamin supplements, there might be some variations in the form of those products that might influence consumption. But really, I think as we take a look at it, the big factors that are really going to influence consumption, aside from things like feeder placement and the space that we provide for animals, the amount of space that we have per animal in a pasture, those types of things. Really, I think salt, our carrier level, and then also phosphorus levels are going to be some big factors that can certainly influence consumption.
What role did technology play in this work?
So technology is a really important aspect of improving our ability to be able to understand some of these aspects in animal behavior a little bit better. And so really, when you go back and you take a look at it historically, most of the mineral intake or salt intake research that has been done, and there hasn't been as much of that type of work done in beef cattle research as much as there has been in other areas, because it's a little bit more challenging to do. But when you take a look at it, most of that research has been done on a herd or on a group basis, where we're trying to understand what our total intake might be across a grazing period, across a season, and some of the variation that we might see. Most of that is all done on a herd or on a group basis. What we don't see when we look at those data are the changes or the variations that we might see on an individual animal basis. And certainly when we think about taking the approach of precision nutrition management, precision animal management, being able to understand what we see on an individual animal basis, I think is certainly important. And what we're doing is, over the last couple of years, is some work that we've done here at K-State is we've used some precision intake equipment, essentially some feed intake monitoring bunks that allow us to be able to capture individual feed consumption on an animal basis, and using that technology in a pasture setting where we're providing free choice salt and mineral supplements to be able to help better understand what kind of consumption that we're seeing on an individual animal basis, and then again going into eventually looking at all the animal behavioral patterns or changes that we might see there as well too.
When you take a individualized look at this, does it help understand more about deficiencies or toxicity when it comes to consumption of mineral?
I think that's certainly a good potential aspect where this type of technology, this precision intake management technology that has really grown in abundance within the industry over the last, I would say 4 to 5 years, certainly. I think certainly that's a potential application where utilizing this type of technology can be beneficial. When we think about a situation, if we have a cow herd that we are trying to navigate a potential issue with either a mineral toxicity or a mineral deficiency, and we know that those situations can certainly occur. Utilizing precision intake technology may be a method for us and might be able to allow us to be able to navigate some information that's certainly valuable when we think about making some management recommendations or some feeding recommendations for that herd to be able to address that situation. We've got a very severe mineral deficiency issue. If we were to measure and be able to better capture what the overall mineral intake has been like on that cow herd for maybe a period of 6 months or out to a year, having that kind of information and utilizing this type of technology could potentially give us some value in being able to navigate that situation with that particular cow herd. So I think big picture, this type of research can certainly help address those types of challenges that we might encounter. And then also, too, I think as you think about the value that it has from a formulation and from a manufacturing standpoint, understanding the proportion of the cow herd within a group that may not be consuming mineral or consuming salt at the recommended level can help aid us from a formulation standpoint to better meet that targeted intake. In our first year of research, and again, we're really just starting to get going with this type of research, we were providing a mineral that had a fairly high salt level alongside a free choice salt supplement, and we were measuring the intake of the two products simultaneously side by side, with the idea being that I think that's a very common practice that our producers would do, and a recommendation that would be very common is if we have a certain percentage of salt in our formula, do we need to provide or supplement additional free choice salt along with it? And what does that do to the consumption of our product when we do that? Our data would suggest from our first year that when we offer those two products side by side, if we've got some free choice salt, that pulls down or does not allow that herd to reach its full intake potential. And I think the data that has previously been done that would be similar in that area has been really pretty minor. And that's what we're trying to capture to be able to help understand what those recommendations need to be so we can guide manufacturers and guide producers so we achieve that proper consumption.
For anyone in Pottawatomie County or around or want to travel to the county, what learning opportunity do they have coming up to hear about this in person?
Absolutely. So we're going to host a cow-calf mineral management field day on Tuesday, August 11th. It'll be in the evening from about 5 to 7 o'clock, and it'll be just outside of Manhattan. We're going to be at our Cedar Creek Ranch, which is part of our Animal Sciences and Industry Department, just north of Manhattan, just a few miles outside of town. And we're going to be going over some of the data that we've talked about here this morning. We ask that folks, if you're interested and able, please RSVP by August 6th if you'd like to attend. And more information on that is available at our beef extension website, ksubeef.org.
Jason, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Appreciate it, Shelby. Thanks for the opportunity.
That was K-State Extension cow-calf specialist Jason Warner. I will link this Pottawatomie Field Day in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back.
Welcome back to Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. We end today's program with this week's milk lines. Midsummer is a good time for dairy producers to evaluate the effectiveness of their fly control methods. If it's not as effective as they'd like, K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk encourages them to focus less on adult flies and focus more on eliminating the spots where fly larvae tends to build up.
Today I'd like to visit with our Kansas dairy producers concerning fly control. As we approach midsummer, how are you doing with fly control around your dairy? You know, a lot of times when we think about fly control, what we concentrate on is the adult flies, and that's really a lot of times where we focus a lot of our control methods. However, what's the real problem? The real problem actually is the buildup of larvae around our dairy and the population that those larvae will produce on our dairy. And as you think about what you should do for control, it's really important that you think about some of these questions that are actually concerned with where you might find those larvae. So before you reach for the next bottle of insecticide to control the adult flies, let's do something about some of those fly breeding areas that are contributing to that fly population. So when you think about stable flies, the biting flies, a lot of times as you get to this time of the year, we see fewer and fewer of those, which is a good thing. Those tend to have a dramatic negative impact on feed intake as well as milk production. So where do we find those larvae hiding? Many times it's around the feed bunk. It's behind the feed bunk. It's where spilt feed has come in contact with moisture. So we have small pockets of debris that can be just loaded with larvae. And of course, all of these become adult flies and add to our problem in the barn. Another primary area that flies utilize for a breeding area and a growing area for the larvae would be calf housing. We got a lot of organic bedding there, usually straw. In some cases, we may have some poor drainage that creates some moisture as well as milk residue from feeding milk, or maybe even the rinsing of the milk feeding buckets as we take care of the calves every day. One of the places that's often missed as we think about the calf housing area is actually that perimeter of the hutch. Most of our hutches have a little bit of a ledge at the very bottom. Underneath that is a great place for materials to collect, including moisture, and for fly larvae to develop. So many times when we move those hutches to disinfect for the next calf, we find those areas, but in between time they serve as a primary area for larvae development. As we think about flies on our dairy, probably the two most common types that you deal with are stable flies and house flies. As we think about pasture cattle, so if we have heifers out on pasture or we have dry cows out on pasture, the situation changes. We need to think about horn flies and face flies. Why do we not see them typically on the dairy? Well, they require fresh manure to lay their eggs in, and that needs to be undisturbed. On the dairy farm, we're usually scraping or flushing maybe a couple of times a day and removing that, so there's really not a lot of fresh manure around for those flies to breed and lay eggs on. So as we think about our efforts to control flies, if things have not worked out very well in your fly control program this year, you might think about where you've been spending your time and maybe where you need to spend time in the future. As we look at our fly control program, maybe 20% of the effort should be on controlling the adult flies and about 80% spent on controlling the larvae. So we have to impact those flies, larvae, where they actually develop, and eliminating those development spots is probably one of the most effective things that we can do in our fly control program. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairy farmers to evaluate their fly control program and evaluate how much time they're actually spending controlling the larvae as opposed to controlling adult flies on their facilities and within their herd.
Thanks, Mike. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.